Welcome viewers. In today's lecture, we will learn about the topic entitled Movement Against Industrialization. Now to go through the objectives. Firstly, to understand the origin of environmental movements both globally and in India. Secondly, to understand the various causes leading to the environmental movements against industrialization. And thirdly, to study about the various movements resulting due to expansion of industry that usually suggest a loss of the natural environment. Environmental movement is a type of social movement that involves an array of individuals, groups, and coalitions that perceive a common interest in environmental protection and acts to bring about changes in environmental policies and practices. The genesis of concern for environmental protection in India can be traced back to the early 20th century when people protested against the commercialization of forest resources during the British colonial period. The three events which occurred within the country in 1973 that facilitated the debate on environmental issues in India are as follows. Firstly, in April, the Government of India announced the launching of Project Tiger, which is an ambitious conservation program aimed at protecting the country's national animal. Secondly, the publication of an article in Economic and Political Weekly entitled A Charter for the Land, authored by B.B. Vora, a high official in the Ministry of Agriculture, which drew attention to the extent of erosion, waterlogging, and other forms of land degradation in the country. Thirdly, on March 27, 1973, in Mandal, a remote Himalayan village, a group of peasants stopped a group of loggers from felling a strand of trees by hugging the trees. This event sparked a series of similar protests through the 1970s, collectively known as the Chipko movement. Now there are various expressions. Firstly, we have the material expression. The material context, broadly speaking, these conflicts have set in opposition on the one side social groups who have gained disproportionately from the economic development whilst being insulated from ecological degradation, and on the other, poor and relatively powerless groups such as the small peasants, pastoral nomads, tribals, and fishing communities, whose livelihoods have been seriously undermined through a combination of resource flows biased against them and a growing deterioration of the environment. While forest, water, and other natural resources are diverted to produce energy and commodities for the rich, the poor are made to bear the social and environmental cost of economic development, whether in the form of declining availability of natural resources, a more polluted environment, or increasingly physical displacement. Next, we have the political expression. With these struggles as its backdrop, the political expression of Indian environmentalism has been organized by social action groups of the victims of environmental degradation. Action groups have embarked upon three distinct, if interrelated, sets of initiatives. First, through a process of organization and struggle, they have tried, with varying degree of success, to prevent the ecologically destructive economic practices. Secondly, they have promoted the environmental message through the skillful use of the media and more innovatively via informal means such as walking tour and eco-developmental camp. Finally, these groups have also taken up programs of environmental rehabilitation, restoring degraded village ecosystem, and thereby enhancing the quality of life of the inhabitants. Next, we have the ideologic expressions. Through the process of struggle, the spreading of consciousness and constructive work, action groups in the environmental field have come to develop an incisive critique of the development process itself, responding to the conflicts over natural resources that have become so sharp in recent years. Environmental activists and intellectuals sympathetic to their work have raised major questions about their orientation of economic planning in India, its inbuilt biases in favor of the commercial industrial sector, and its neglect of ecological consideration. More hesitantly, they have tried to outline an alternate framework for development, which they argue would be both ecologically sustainable and socially just. Although perspectives within the movement are themselves quite varied in its totality, this fostering of a public debate on development options constitutes the ideological expressions of the environmental movement. As already noted, struggles over the issue of nature have a long history. Popular upsurges like the Kumaun Forest movement of 1921 and the Mulshi Satyagraha of the same year may justifiably be claimed as part of the prehistory of modern environmental conflicts in India, insofar as there is a marked continuity in forms of resistance. The contemporary environmental movement is, to a considerable extent, a peasant movement draped in the cloth of environmentalism. Thus, many of the methods by which communities have resisted environmental degradation and or external control of natural resources fall under the overall rubric of satyagraha, literally truth force, but used more generally to denote non-violent resistance. Among the variety of protest forms used by groups resisting environmental degradation, we may single out 6. First comes the Pradarshan, a collective show of strength by communities at the receiving end of the environmental degradation, be the peasants opposing commercial forestry or fisher folk protesting the ravages of trawling. The Pradarshan is intended primarily to demonstrate popular disaffection and the strength of numbers. It shades imperceptibly into a more militant form of protest, the dharna or sit-down strike. A more sharply focused variant of the dharna is the gherao. Here, a key authority figure, a senior bureaucrat or politician perhaps, is surrounded by protesters and heckled till he accedes to their demands or is rescued by the police. Exasperated by the attitude of the Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra governments, supporters of the Narmada Bachao Andolon sat for days on the national highway between Delhi and Bombay, blocking passenger and commodity traffic on a vital artery. Fifth, we have the resurrection of a classic technique of Gandhian nationalism, the Jail Bharo Andolon, literally movement to fill the jails. The Bhuk Hartal is most frequently the preserve of one charismatic figure. The fast unto death by a widely respected popular leader is a coercive technique to compel the state to yield in fear of the consequences of the leader succumbing to the fast. Environmental action groups in India have thus utilized a varied and flexible repertoire of protest. These distinctive forms of struggle are, of course, both overlapping and complementary. Nor is our list exhaustive. New forms are being created even as we write. The Narmada movement has already witnessed a major Sangharsh Yatra, struggle march, while its participants have frequently threatened a spectacular Jal Samadhi, literally water burial. In other words, to immerse themselves in the rising water of the reservoir rather than be displaced from their ancestral land. All in all, this repertoire of protest has helped to focus public attention on specific natural resource conflicts. In a democracy which allows dissent, but where the state tilts markedly towards the rich and the powerful, these forms of protest collectively constitute the weapons of the weak. So with this we come to our first quiz. The event not responsible for facilitating the environmental debate in India in 1973. The answers are number 1, Project Tiger, number 2, the Chipko movement, number 3, the Silent Valley movement, and number 4, the Chartered for the Land. And the correct option is Chartered for the Land. Now we will learn about the role of communication and education in the progress of these various environmental movements. The leading environmental activists sometimes write signed articles in newspapers, drawing attention to the struggle they are engaged in. More often, sympathetic journalists write on these struggles and their wider implications. Since the mid-1970s, there has been a virtual explosion of environmental writing in English and Indian language newspapers and magazines. With radio and television controlled by the state, the print media has played an important role in reporting, interpreting, and publicizing nature-based conflicts in modern India. In understanding the spread of environmental consciousness, however, one must not underestimate oral communication. For example, the popular science group, the KSSP, has performed plays and rendered folk songs in all parts of Kerala in order to increase popular awareness of deforestation and pollution. In the neighboring state of Karnataka, themes of environmental abuse and renewal have figured in the traditional dance drama of the West Coast, Yakshagana, an activity which combines discussion and practical action is the eco-development camp, widely used by action groups to promote afforestation and other forms of environmental restoration. Now, ecological restoration. Why is it important? In focusing on environmental rehabilitation in preference to struggle or publicity, some groups have been influenced by the Gandhian tradition of the constructive work, others by religious reform movements, and yet others by the example of international relief organizations. Often groups with a background of work in healthcare, education, or women's issues have turned in recent years to promoting sound natural resource management. 3 brief case studies have presented below to illustrate the variety of groups engaged in the ecological restoration. We start with the group that pioneered the Chipko movement, the Dashauli Gram Swarajya Mandal. While one wing of Chipko, identified with Sundarlal Bahuguna, has preferred to connect Himalayan deforestation with national and global environmental concerns, the DGSM, under the leadership of Chandni Prasad Bhatt, has turned from struggle to reconstruction work at the grassroots. A second example of successful eco-restoration work also originated in a process of struggle. In the Sangli district of Maharashtra, where socialist workers have long been active, peasants have been faced with persistent drought. In this context, 2 villages of Khanapur Taluk, encouraged by socialist and popular science activists, decided to build on a cooperative basis a small dam across a river that sporadically contained water. The reasons of the emergence of environmental movements in India are as follows. The major reason of the emergence of environmental movements in India, which includes reasons such as number 1, control over natural resources, number 2, false developmental policies of the government, number 3, socio-economic reasons, number 4, environmental degradation or destruction, number 5, spread of environmental awareness and media. As pointed out above, a large number of environmental movements have emerged in India, especially after 1970s. These movements have grown out of a series of independent responses to local issues in different places at different times. The emergence of environmental movement is not restricted to any particular part of the country. The environmental movements have emerged from the Himalayan regions of Uttar Pradesh to the tropical forest of Kerala and from Gujarat to Tripura. The main environmental movements are Chipko Andolon, Save the Bhagirathi and Stop Tehri Project Committee in Uttar Pradesh, Save the Narmada movement, which is also known as the Narmada Bachao Andolon in Madhya Pradesh and Gujarat, youth organizations and tribal people in the Gandhamardhan Hills, whose survival is directly threatened by the development of bauxite deposits, the opposition to the Balyapal and Bhogarite test range in Orissa, the Appiko movement in the Western Ghats, groups opposing the Kaiga nuclear power plant in Karnataka, the campaign against the Silent Valley project are to name some. The Bishnoi movement. This movement was led by Amrita Devi, in which around 363 people sacrificed their lives for the protection of their forest. This movement was the first of its kind to have developed the strategy of hugging or embracing the trees for their protection spontaneously. This is one of the oldest movements that is known to have occurred almost 400 years back. Next, we have the Chipko movement. The Chipko is one of the world's known environmental movements in India. The Chipko movement focused world attention on the environmental problems of the Alakananda catching area in the mid-western Himalayas. Chipko movement launched to protect the Himalayan forest from destruction in 1973 has its root in the pre-independence days. Many struggles were organized to protest against the colonial forest policy during the early decades of the 20th century. The main demand of the people in these protests was that the benefits of the forest, especially the right to fodder, should go to the local people. The name of the movement, that is Chipko, comes from the word embrace in Hindi. It is said that the villagers hugged or embraced or stuck to the trees in the forest to prevent it from being felled by the contractors. The strategy of embracing the trees to resist the felling of the trees was thought of by Chandi Prasad Bhatt in a meeting in the Mandal on April 1, 1973. The name Chipko was derived from the consensual strategy of clinging onto the trees as a non-violent, direct action. Next, we have the Silent Valley movement. The Silent Valley in Kerala has a rich 89 square kilometer biological treasure trove in the vast expanse of tropical virgin forest on the green rolling hills. In 1980s, a 200 milliwatt hydroelectric dam on the crystal clear river Kunthi Puza under the Kundre Mukh project was to come up. The proposed project was not ecologically viable as it would drown a chunk of the valuable rainforest of the valley and threaten the life of a host of endangered species of both flora and fauna. The movement acknowledged the obvious economic needs of the people of Malabar, but concluded that the Silent Valley project would make only a marginal contribution to the regional development. Thus, the group opposed the project with a campaign that brought into sharp focus the ecological consequences, specifically the possibility of extinction of species that have evolved over millions of years. The movement began to challenge the idea that energy generated by the dam would benefit the rural people of Kerala. Most of the energy from the project was to be exported to industrialized areas of Kerala and surrounding states. The movement asserted that the local environment would be disrupted with benefits going to Trivandrum, the state capital. The central issue of the Silent Valley protest included the protection of the tropical rainforest, maintenance of the ecological balance. The campaign and petitions were the main strategies adopted by the activists in the movement. basing it on the non-violent Gandhian ideological orientation. The protest against the destruction of forest and opposition to ecologically unsustainable development, and above all, maintenance of the ecological balance. Next, we have the Appiko movement, which is one of the forest-based environmental movements in India. The movement took place in the Uttarakhand district of Karnataka in the Western Ghats. A group of youth in Beligadi village protesting against moves to establish teak plantations wrote to forest officials asking them to stop clearing the natural forest. But this appeal was ignored. Then the villagers decided to launch a movement. They invited S.L. Bahuguna, the architect of the Chipko movement, and gathered local people to take up oath to protect trees by embracing them. In September 1983, when the X-Men came for felling the Kalasi forest, people embraced the trees and thus the Appiko movement was launched. The Appiko movement succeeded in its threefold objectives, which includes protecting the existing forest cover, regeneration of trees in denuded land, and thirdly, utilizing forest wealth with proper consideration to conservation of natural resources. The Appiko movement saved the basic life sources for the people. Trees like bamboo, useful for making handcrafted items, which they could sell for earning a few rupees. It also saved medicinal trees for their use by the local people. The movement created awareness among the villagers throughout the Western Ghats and the ecological danger posed by the commercial and industrial interests to their forest, which was the main source of sustenance. Next, we have the Narmada Bachao Andolon. The most popular movement in the environmental history of India is the movement against the Narmada River Valley project, which started in the year 1985. The Narmada Valley is the site of one of the world's largest multi-purpose water project, the Narmada River Development Project, which involves the construction of 30 large dams and many small ones on the river and its 51 main tributaries. The project will transform the valley and the lives of its residents and will increase the food production and hydropower generation in Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra. However, the construction of dam and reservoirs will displace an estimated 1 million people and will submerge 350,000 hectares of forest land and 2 lakh hectares of agricultural land. The Narmada Bachao Andolon has drawn upon a multiplicity of discourses for protests such as displacement risk and resettlement provisions, environmental impact and sustainability issues, financial implications of the project, forceful evictions and violations of civil liberties, issues pertaining to river valley planning and management, implications of Western growth model, and alternative development and appropriate technology, among many other. The movement uses various tools of protest such as satyagraha, Jal Samarpan, Rasta Roko, Gaon Bandh, demonstrations and rallies, hunger strikes, and blockade of projects. Next, we have the Tehri Dam conflict, one of the most protracted environmental movements in the recent years is the movement against the Tehri Dam. The 260.5 meter high Tehri Dam on the Bhagirathi in the Garhwal Himalaya. It will support prosperity by generating 2,400 megawatts peaking power, which according to the dam builders will help in establishing 140 industrial cities. The project has generated controversy since its inception. In spite of objections of several scientists of national and international repute, the project is yet to be modified or stopped. The conflict started in the 1990s. However, it failed to gain the popularity in both the national and the international level. The dam construction continued even after all the protest, but at a slower pace. due to legal issues from the environmentalists. Next and lastly, we come to Shingur Andolon. In May 2006, the West Bengal government decided to acquire 997 acres for the Tata Motor, small car factory in the Shingur of Hooghly district. Almost 6,000 families, including many agricultural workers and marginal peasants, were to lose their land and livelihoods. There was no compensation taken for the landless agricultural workers, unrecorded bargainers and other rural households who were indirectly dependent for their livelihood on the land and agricultural activities. Almost all the landowners had also expressed their unwillingness to give their land from the inception of the project. This led to the protest by the people. However, initially the protest was carried out peacefully. The main reason behind the protest was the loss of livelihood of the villagers who solely depended on the agricultural land due to advancement in industrialization. Now with this, we come to the second quiz. The question is, Silent Valley is located in which state? The options are A. Kerala, B. Uttar Pradesh, C. West Bengal, and D. Maharashtra. And the correct answer is A. Kerala. So, to conclude, in this lecture series, we have learnt about the various movements, or what we can say are the various environmental movements that have come up against industrializations. Now, what we see in these movements is that nobody is against urbanization or industrialization, but people are more against the consequences that arises due to the expansion of these industrialization, mainly the way the environment is degraded. There is a loss of agricultural land, loss of green cover, loss of forest cover.